If you go back in history, you see that honey was respected all over the world as a very potent medicine. People were not just using it as a sweetener, as we do today. People were relying on it for helping them with all kinds of ailments.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey guys, I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore, and this is episode 198. Our guest today is Leo Sharashkin. Leo learned beekeeping from his uncle in his native Russia. He holds a degree in forestry from the University of Missouri and teaches natural beekeeping at his apiary and around the world. He homesteads in the Ozarks, southern Missouri, where he catches wild honeybee swarms. It sounds wild, right? That's what we thought. Today, he sheds light on all things bee. He offers his theory on why we have a dying bee population, what wild beekeeping looks like, his horizontal hive invention, and why not all honey on the supermarket shelves is true honey. We think you'll be enthralled by this show today. Sorry, we couldn't help ourselves. Anyway, before we dive into it, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Bovine Tracheal Cartilage with Liver by Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Our family can't get enough of these supplements. I personally love the liver, and all of it is based on the ancient wisdom of like supports like. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. And a quick reminder that our Wise Traditions Conference is coming up November 15th to the 17th, just north of Dallas, Texas. Make plans to attend today. It is a gathering that nourishes in every way. The Wise Traditions Conference, where ancestral wisdom meets modern science. Register today at wisetraditions.org. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Leo.
Thank you, Hilda. It's my pleasure to be sharing my exciting news about honeybees with your audience.
Leo, I have heard that hives are collapsing and bees are disappearing at alarming rates. Is this true? And if so, what do they think is causing it?
Well, it's true and not true at the same time. If you are talking about the agricultural landscapes of monocultures being sprayed with pesticides, not just honeybees, but many other pollinators, including butterflies and native bees, they're of course suffering. If you put the map of corn growing over the map of the density of pollinators, you will see that there is a very strong pollination. So in agricultural landscapes, yes, bees and other pollinators are suffering a lot from the loss of habitat and from pesticides. Also, it's true that there is a very high mortality of honeybees in conventional beekeepers' hives. However, at the same time, in the wilderness across this country, the bees are doing just fine. And even if you live in the city, you are probably aware that there are many bees living in bee trees and parks and elsewhere, or they may even move behind siding and be living in people's homes or inside the wall. So these kinds of bees are not disappearing and not collapsing. And it really begs a question as to why. The answer is these wild bees, they were honed by natural selection to be resistant to diseases and parasites, so they're very hardy. The bees that most beekeepers use in their beehives are bred by beekeepers for 100 years for high honey production and to be gentle, but the health of these bees was never on the top priority list. So after 100 years of the effort to domesticate the honeybee, we ended up with the bee that's not doing well in terms of health and disease resistance. And this is why you see all these alarming news about bees disappearing and this colony collapse disorder, as they call it.
Oh my gosh, no one had ever explained that distinction to me, and it makes a lot of sense. In other words, where there are monocrops growing, the bees don't have their natural habitat, So that's impacting them. And then conventional beekeepers are also breeding and working with a different kind of bee, and it's not as hardy. That's what I hear you saying.
That's absolutely true. So, in an agricultural landscape, it's not just the pesticides that are killing the bee, it's also the loss of nutritional diversity in their diet. They may be in a field with clover or alfalfa in bloom with a huge amount of nectar, but most of this nectar is coming just from one plant and doesn't have all the nutrients that the bees need. If the bee is living in the woods, she would be feeding on hundreds of different species of wildflowers and blooming trees, and this provides her with much better nutrition that's essential for her to maintaining her health.
So, just like us, bees need a diverse diet.
Yeah, imagine yourself, even if you eat something very nutritious, but it's the only thing you are allowed to eat for 6 months in a row, you probably wouldn't be very happy and very healthy.
Absolutely. So, are scientists figuring this out, or is it just you, Leo?
No, it's not my personal opinion. We have a lot of science behind that. There is this famous bee researcher from Cornell University, Tom Seeley, who just published a book a month ago talking about the resilience of the wild bees and how far we have departed in our beekeeping from what the bees expect as a good environment and a good lifestyle. It's the same with livestock and with plants too. Compare the cow that ranchers use today with the wild equivalent of a cow. Of course, now the domesticated animals have become completely dependent on us, and I would hate to see the same thing happening to the honeybee. So we are very fortunate that we still have all these wonderful wild colonies living in bee trees in the woods without our interference.
Are you kind of saying that some forms of beekeeping are almost like the concentrated animal feeding operations that we see in industrial livestock?
Yeah, that's totally true. Most people who are not into beekeeping do not realize that today almost all beekeepers feed their bees sugar water. Honey is much more valuable than sugar, so there is this huge economic incentive to take more honey from the bees, and so they don't starve in the winter, give them sugar to eat instead of allowing them to live on their natural diet that would be pollen and honey. So imagine yourself if your diet was substituted with just sugar, and no wonder you would be sickly. The same is true about the honeybees. So unfortunately, a lot of what you hear about the bees suffering today has to do with conventional industrial beekeeping practices, the same way as the health of the animals is compromised by intensive feeding operations for livestock and anything else.
So, talk to us about what your beekeeping looks like. I imagine it doesn't look like what you were just describing.
Yes, it's very different. First, when we moved to the Ozarks of southern Missouri and decided to start the apiary, the first thing and the first mistake that you will want to avoid is do not buy bees from the commercial sources. Instead, you can very easily attract swarms to specially baited hives, and this is what we did. So we put in the spring boxes on trays baited with the scent, the pheromone that the bees like. And just as birds move into birdhouses, these wild swarms that are plentiful almost everywhere in this country, they move into these baited hives. And so you start with the stock that has very high level of disease resistance, and also it's adapted to your local conditions. If you start keeping bees the conventional way, and say you live in Minnesota, most likely the bees that you will buy in a package from a bee breeder, they're not coming from Minnesota. They're being raised somewhere in Georgia or California and then being shipped north. So you end up with bees that come from a subtropical climate. And of course, they will not be acclimated to your local conditions. So the first thing that I do differently, instead of buying bees, I get free swarms by attracting them to my baited hives. And once you have this increasingly robust stock adapted to local conditions, the rest is easy. I put them in hives that have very good insulation in the walls to protect them from the extremes of temperature, and pretty much leave them alone until the time comes to harvest some honey.
It sounds amazing and really intriguing. My question to you is, why wouldn't you just harvest the honey from wherever the bees are naturally storing it, in those trees you were describing earlier in the park and that sort of thing? Why beekeep in the first place?
In fact, the history of beekeeping and honey hunting was exactly that. For thousands of years, the only source of honey was climbing into a tree or on a cliff in the tropics where bees make their nests, and they're getting some honey from them. However, it's quite a challenge to do so without either disturbing very severely or even destroying the colony. So over the time, as these wild colonies were being lost and the habitat that they depend upon was being lost, people had to start keeping bees first because the wild honey was no longer as available as it used to be, and also to allow you to harvest honey with less disturbance than what would be involved in cutting down the tree or opening up the cavity where they live and cutting out honeycombs as a form of obtaining honey from the wild bees.
I see. So let's talk about honey for a little bit. I've heard, first of all, that it keeps forever and it has beneficial nutrients in it. Is that true? Like, I heard that they found some honey in Egypt that they suspect, is thousands of years old, and yet we could still consume it. Is that right?
That's right and not right at the same time. With chemical analysis, you would be able to indeed identify the substance as honey. However, as time goes by, honey starts crystallizing. That means that there are sugar crystals that start growing inside honey, and after a number of years, there are these very hard sugar crystals surrounded by some liquid, which eventually will be slowly evaporating. So after a very long period of time, what would be left of honey is this very hard sugary substance, and we would not readily call it honey, even though, yes, it could be consumed and be sweet after a very long period of time.
Okay, so I understand I'm not going to grab that honey from that tomb and start eating it. But what benefits does honey have for us today?
It's a very complicated question because if you go back in history, you see that honey was respected all over the world as a very potent medicine. People were not just using it as a sweetener, as we do today. People were relying on it for helping them with all kinds of ailments. However, we need to realize that this was in the time when sweet stuff and sugars were just not available. So people were consuming so little sugar in their diet, then a boost of energy that can come from a tablespoon of honey could really help providing the nutrients that might not be available from other foods that people were consuming. However, today, our diets are so different, and we're already consuming probably much more sugar than is natural for our body. And if you eat honey by the tablespoon every day, I don't think it would have any medicinal benefits, just because in addition to the valuable nutrients and enzymes and pollen that honey contains, you would also be overloading yourself with sugars. And honey does contain a lot of sugar.
I see. Wow, that's really intriguing. I know that mostly you're right. People use it now to sweeten food as opposed to for its medicinal properties. But talk to me a little bit now, Leo, about fake honey. Like, I've heard that there is honey on the market that isn't even real, and I can't quite wrap my head around that. Can you explain what they're talking about when people talk about kind of pseudo honey?
Yeah, absolutely. People just don't realize that in this country, between 2/3 and 3/4 of honey consumed today is not produced in the US anymore. It's being imported from all over the world, including from China. And there is nothing intrinsically wrong with Chinese honey. However, the traders who buy honey from China at very low prices, they need to pay very high taxes at the border when they bring this honey into the US. And many of them are wanting to avoid paying these taxes at the border. So a very logical way is to transship this honey from China through a third country. like label it as coming from Vietnam, Australia, or some other part of the world. Now, it's very easy to tell the origin of honey, because if you put one drop of honey under the microscope, you will be able to see the pollen that's in honey. And each pollen species is different from the other. So by identifying what trees and flowers gave this pollen, you are able to tie it to a particular geographic region. Now, if you see that this Vietnamese or Australian honey at the customs or when crossing border into America has pollen that only belongs to the plants growing in such and such province in China, you will have evidence that this is a product of Chinese beekeeping. So in order to conceal the origin, many of these traders are microfiltering honey, removing every single speck of pollen. And this can only be achieved by heating honey to a very high temperature that will destroy many of its properties, and then using very high pressure. So this is part of the reason why much of the honey doesn't taste anymore like honey. It's more like syrup. Not even to mention the fact that many traders do adulterate honey by adding syrup to it. I know the statistics from the European Union. Even in this tightly regulated market in Europe, 18% of jars that are sold as honey on the supermarket shelf are not honey at all. They are the mixture of different syrups. And the adulterators are using such advanced techniques to mimic the composition of honey. They may even be adding enzymes artificially to make it look like honey, that it's increasingly difficult and expensive to identify this fraudulent fake honey. So unless you know the beekeeper you are getting the honey from, or unless you're keeping bees yourself, you may not really be sure whether the jar that has honey on it is really 100% honey.
Coming up, Leo talks more about the issues of honey adulteration, and he talks about pesticide residues as well. He also tells us his backstory, why he started keeping wild bees in the first place.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Ancestral Supplements with bovine tracheal cartilage with liver. Ancestral Supplements offers New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and bovine tracheal cartilage in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. The life's work of Dr. John F. Pruden showed that bovine tracheal cartilage had unique and powerful effects on wound healing, immune conditions, joint health, and other conditions considered to be treatment-resistant to conventional therapies. All of these conditions were immune in nature with the exception of the wound healing studies. According to Dr. Pruden, bovine cartilage closely resembles fetal mesenchyme, the primordial tissue which muscle, bone, tendons, ligaments, skin, fat, and bone marrow, the heart of the immune system, all develop. Bovine tracheal cartilage provided concentrated amounts of connective tissue, immunoregulators, and cartilage building blocks that are now missing from the modern diet. So visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. A quick reminder that the Wise Traditions Conference is coming up November 15th to 17th, just north of Dallas, Texas. Hear what attendee Charles Green had to say at last year's conference.
Food and health had always been like a big part of like kind of the things my mom and I shared. So I was like, she sent it because she was like, oh, you'll probably find this interesting. And I was like, cool. And I had no idea how important it would actually be. So it's been like, holy crap, like this is crazy cool. Like, it's cool.
So join us, you guys. Go to wisetraditions.org to sign up today. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Wow, it reminds me of this kind of olive oil scandal that there's been in recent years. In other words, we've uncovered that it might say extra virgin, cold pressed, but it may actually be more of a blend of a variety of olive oils and still merit that label somehow. This is something we've heard in the U.S. recently.
Yes, and that's of great concern. I'm going to Epimonde, which is the World Congress of Beekeepers in Montreal, Canada in September in 2019. And there will be a whole half-day discussion on the adulteration of honey. Even if the beekeepers are not adulterating their honey, there is a great incentive for honey packers to be blending honey with some kind of syrup to increase their economic gain. Because sugar syrup may be 50 cents a pound and honey is much more expensive. So unfortunately, this fuels a lot of adulteration.
So you speak so knowledgeably about all of this, Leo. Have you been beekeeping your whole life?
Yes, that's true. I grew up in Russia, and my uncle is the beekeeper in the family. He has been keeping bees since before I was born. So I was spending my summers, even as a small child, there in his village with the bees. The reason we started keeping bees here in Missouri is we were not finding this tasteful honey loaded with pollen, not heated, not processed, that was coming straight from the hive and the flavors that I grew up with.
Oh, so you wanted to kind of make the real deal. Now, is it
Yeah.
hard? Is beekeeping hard?
No, well, it depends on the way you go. The conventional kind of beekeeping is very labor intensive and it's not really helpful anymore. We are all concerned about the quality of the food we eat and the presence of pesticide residues in food. It's disappointing that today much of American honey, or most of American honey, actually has a lot of pesticide in it, not only because the bees are bringing it from the contaminated flowers, but also the beekeepers themselves put all kinds of chemicals into their hives to fight such and such parasite or such and such disease. So if you wanted to go this conventional way, they tell you in the beginner beekeepers class, you need to buy the bees, you need to buy the equipment, but you also need to buy such and such drugs to administer to your bees. And then many of these commercial bees are not surviving even their first winter, and you need to buy more bees the following spring. So it becomes very expensive very quickly. And as a result, the honey that you are eating is not even what you wanted to get. It will be laced with pesticide. However, there is another way to go about it. If you do it how beekeeping was done for hundreds of years, you attract their local honeybee swarms to small baited hives, and then you give them the freedom to have a good time and live their natural life as they would, and open the hive a couple times a year and just to add more frames or for them to build honeycomb in and then to harvest honey. It can be very enjoyable and something I could call as a lazy beekeeping or keeping bees with a smile that doesn't break your budget and above all doesn't break your back. And I'm saying not breaking your back. Yeah, because the conventional way, when you have to handle 50 or 60-pound boxes of your hive regularly, moving them up and down, that's very stressful on the bees, but it's also very hard on the beekeeper's body.
Right. And the bees you're describing in this more natural hive where you just let them have a good time, like I know that is going to resonate with our listeners. It resonates with me as an image of kind of sustainable, natural, beyond organic, ways of living that we prefer our farmers to use and that we ourselves adopt to live our best lives. Because when the animals, or the insects in this case, are happy and living as they should, everything is more nutritious and delicious and beautiful, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. But also, ultimately, we need to ask ourselves a question. If you want to get into beekeeping, do you want it really to become hard work for you? And some people think that's the only choice they have. But the hives I'm using, for example, are horizontal hives. Instead of stacking boxes one above the other, and this would involve heavy lifting when these boxes are full of honey, I position all the honeycombs on one level in one long box. So instead of expanding the hive vertically, I expand it horizontally. And because of this arrangement, I don't have to handle heavy supers of frames. I just can pull one frame at a time. So no heavy lifting involved. All of a sudden becomes much more enjoyable. And you're also very true in saying that people are concerned about the health of their diet. And the bees make us particularly aware of what's happening in the environment because the bees not just live in a hive box that you gave them, they travel for 2 miles or more from your hive to collect food for themselves. And if there is pesticide sprayed even 2 miles from where the hive is located, it will end up in honey. So I'm very thankful to the bees for making me more aware, not just of my backyard or front yard, but of what is happening for miles and miles around me. And if I were to see that my bees were not thriving in a place where the hives are, it would really beg the question, is this place safe for us humans to live? And today there is no more excuse to be poisoning our environment because we have solid evidence, scientific evidence, and trials that lasted for decades that you can grow the world's food supply organically. And people can have plenty of food to eat around the world without any use of GMO technology or pesticides, synthetic fertilizers. The same is true about beekeeping. I spent the last 10 days in the mountains of Vermont with a beekeeper with 800 colonies who has not treated his bees with any chemicals in 17 years, and his bees are thriving. So it's tragic that not only the landscapes are being polluted and poisoned with pesticides, and the same is happening in many beekeepers' hives. It's tragic that all of this is not really necessary and is still happening on this massive scale.
Oh my goodness, I'm just shaking my head. We, try to come up with methods to improve on nature, and we just end up messing it up as humankind, it seems at times. But I want to ask you two questions, Leo, as we start to wrap up. One is, why is the role of a bee as a pollinator so important to our food? Some people have said without bees, we're going to be malnourished. We're not going to get what we need. Can you explain that a little bit?
Of course, there are many different insects that can pollinate plants. And pollination is, of course, are essential for a very large portion of our food supply. You would think it's only about vegetables and fruit, but no, it's also about meat and other products because the animals need forage crops, and many of these forage crops also require bee pollination. So bees are essential for pollinating the plants that provide food to us. However, it's not true that if honeybees were to disappear, that we would follow 4 years later. There is this urban legend saying that Einstein said that humanity would disappear if within 4 years if bees were to disappear from the face of the earth. I just want you to be aware that he never said that. And in China, farmers are now pollinating their fruit trees by hand. In certain regions,
I've heard of that.
Yeah, I saw the pictures. It's surreal, but it can be done. So bees are very important for pollinating the crops. But more importantly, I think that's the lesson they're teaching us. The reason they're so important for pollinating the crops is that instead of being solitary, like most bees are, they live on their own, they procreate, but they are not living in a big society like honeybees do. So as opposed to these solitary bees, of which there are hundreds of species around the world, what's so unique about the honeybees is that they live together as one big community. And with 30 or 50,000 bees in one hive living as one society and with division of labor, they're being able to accomplish so much more than a single bee could. And to me, it's also a message relevant to us. If only we learned to be working again in the spirit of cooperation rather than competition, and also learning from the bees to be using natural resources without destroying them. That gives me a lot of inspiration. You look at the bee, and yes, she does use the world around her. She gets pollen and nectar from the plants, and without that, she would die. So she does use the plants, but in a non-destructive way. Actually, the pollination that she provides as a byproduct of her looking after her own livelihood makes the landscapes more and more beautiful. I wish we could live in this manner.
I do too. That is a beautiful picture of how we should all live. Those bees are such a cute example for us. I want a t-shirt that says bees are beautiful.
Yes, true.
But I do want to wrap up with this question now, Leo. If the listener could do one thing to improve their health, or maybe I would even say to look out for bees more, what would you recommend that they do?
Oh, I would recommend going and planting a tree that would provide food for the bees. If you live in the north, it could be basswood. If you look in the south, it could be tulip, poplar, or some other tree. But first, you'll get very good exercise by planting the tree and then caring for the tree and watering it the first couple years. But then, it's such a long-term investment, not just in the future of honeybees, but in the future of humanity too. Part of the problem with our culture today is that we have our vision reduced to the immediate future. We are looking at the short term. When we plant trees, we really start looking not only at our existence, but at the world around us in the long term. It takes such a long time for the tree to grow that we start pondering questions on eternity and whether we should be sacrificing the health of the planet to satisfy the immediate wants of today's humanity. So many philosophers throughout history and many ecologists today were affirming that every person should plant at least a few trees in their lifetime, not only for the ecological and health benefits that it brings, but as part of our spiritual journey as well.
Well, thank you so much for that advice, Leo. I think it's fantastic. I would love to see this planet populated by more trees and more bees. And thank you for doing your part in that.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Tom. Thank you, Hilda.
Our guest today was Leo Sharashkin. Check out his website, horizontalhive.com, for free hive plans and advice. You can find me at Holistic Hilda on Instagram. And for the show notes for this and every episode of the Wise Traditions podcast, just go to our website, westonaprice.org. And that's it. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice. On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care.